everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're just in the middle of our book the start of our book of Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Ideology by the J.P. Moreland, who is a stalwart in the apologetic circles and has been for a number of years. He's probably up there on the Mount Rushmore next to William Lane Craig, and we'll sneak Van Til in there as well, and we won't tell him. But so this book, from our last book on miracles, where we pretty much destroyed David Hume quite well, and by we, I mean the author, we kind of focused a little bit on the term scientism, and J.P. Moreland defines his concept of scientism as it's roughly the view that the hard sciences alone have the intellectual authority to give us knowledge of reality. Everything else, especially ethics, theology, and philosophy, is at least according to scientism based on private emotions, blind faith, and cultural upbringing. And so he's going to now get into the first chapters here of talking about what leads it to be this dangerous ideology. So we've already covered the introduction in chapter 1, and you can go back to previous episodes and look at that. But today we're going to start with chapter 2 by talking about why does scientism matter exactly, and we'll kind of go from there and talk about kind of how it's changed the intellectual zeitgeist, and especially the universities in the next chapter as well. All right, so Moreland kicks off chapter 2 here on why scientism matters by saying, because scientism is the air we breathe, we consider it to be both normal and essential. Very few people are aware of what it does to a culture and to the church. And so this is almost the idea of that politics is downstream from culture, and sometimes we see culture being affected a little bit more in the universities. Now, you can probably make an argument for and against that as well, but the current political zeitgeist in the world today, we could probably point to the universities and say that has kind of started in academia and entered the church from there, and so and the culture as well. So I think we do see this type of scientism having a great impact on how we think, and then it transfers over into what we believe is a culture and a church. Believe this, the science is.
Exactly. And the last chapter was entitled, the scientific air we breathe.
Right.
So this is kind of the background assumption that we have as a culture and society. And so here he is trying to help us to see how it has affected actually the church, mainly is what we're going to get into.
Right. So this scientism puts Christian claims outside of the plausibility structures. You just can't, you can hold it yourself for whatever reasons it might give you, but just don't bring it into kind of the public square. It's antiquated. It's outside the purview of commonality. And so what people generally consider reasonable and rational is what the hard science is going to be talking about. And so this has led to a number of shifts in how our culture processes reality. And so even within the church, it has harmed our efforts to produce mature disciples of Christ, both in children and adults. And so he's going to then take those claims and talk about them kind of one at a time.
Right. So he's going to give us here a list of why he thinks scientism matters, which is what this chapter is all about. So here's number 1. Here's the first one. He says scientism puts Christian claims outside of the plausibility structure. So he's kind of already mentioned this, and now he wants to elucidate this a little better. He says the extent that scientism is embracing our culture, to that extent, our moral and spiritual claims will be decognitivized. So there's a mouthful, right? In other words, cognitivism has to do with whether or not a particular claim is true or false. And so he's suggesting that scientism cognitivizes our moral and spiritual claims. In other words, what he's going to say is, which is what I think we saw in the early part of the 20th century with the positivists, that moral claims, they said, were neither true nor false, right? They were kind of meaningless. Remember all the stuff that the positivists were doing. And so he's suggesting that that's what's going on here. He says, in other words, our deepest beliefs about life, which, come from moral and spiritual claims, our deepest beliefs about life and knowledge and history and reality seem to be utterly implausible, right? Not just untrue, but unworthy of rational consideration, right? As a culture, which has a set of background assumptions or a plausibility structure. So notice what he means by plausibility structure is this background assumptions that we have. He says it's a set of framework that what people think, which affects how they're willing to listen, evaluate, feel, and behave. And all this now has affected, moral and spiritual claims. The framework, he says, shapes what people consider plausible or implausible. So, it's kind of like what we would think with, I don't know, we can think of paradigms in the philosophy of science with Kuhn's paradigm shifts and that sort of thing. And so now we've shifted, he's suggesting, into this kind of paradigm where certain claims now are irrelevant and they don't make any sense and they're, irrational to hold. And so he's suggesting that scientism has done that to notice moral and spiritual claims, which is kind of interesting here. And he's going to play this out.
Yeah, I mean, look at the popular people, maybe on the way out right now, which is interesting to talk about. But the people that have kind of been put front and center in telling us kind of how to live in pop culture has been people like Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins, all scientists or close to scientists in their own right, but kind of well known to the general public. And they moved from hosting Bill Nye the Science Guy or their own version of Cosmos, harkening back to Carl Sagan, or dissecting the neck of a giraffe for Dawkins there. But then they go on to say, I know these things through science, but let me then tell you how to live. And we see the backlash that happens because then you have Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye using their platforms to talk about the whole transgenderism. You have Dawkins kind of being extolled to admit that he likes living in a world of Christianity, and that's because in jolly old England he's living under almost the totalitarianism of multiculturalism and Islam. And yes, who wouldn't like to see that? And so we see that scientism doesn't give you kind of this grand finale, put a point on it, but we have seen people try to embrace these new thought leaders that have come out and said, I know science and I know things, me smart man, now listen to me about how you shall live. And we can almost kind of, at least in the before times, see why that split would be the case. But we're trying so close to pair what we know about the physical sciences to then how we should live that we then run into the wall that separates them. All right, so plausibility structures, however, are usually so widespread and so subtle that people typically don't even know that they are functioning. This can lead to problems with trusting in God. Without our being aware, we all carry with us the cultural map informed by scientism, he says. A set of natural assumptions we make, like self-talk, default beliefs, which we naturally accept without argument, so are a priori, or things that we feel embarrassed to believe, claims contrary to the authority of the cultural map. The Western cultural plausibility structure emphasizes science and scorns religion currently. This may lend us to a natural set of doubts about Christianity, which, again, is ironic because the history of 2,000 years of the past Western cultural map has been informed from the Christian perspective and has led from the Greeks and the Romans, and we captured those cultures and a lot of what they had to offer and said the crooked path can lead us to the straight one, and we can take the good things with the bad and redeem the bad and take what is good from God's nature and carry it through to Western civilization. And it's only kind of right here in the 20th, 21st century that we've tried to shear off the head and still had the rattle tail.
Yeah, and if we go back, the beginning of science, we might say, all of the early scientists many anyway, at least Western science, were believers. They believed the whole notion of the laws of nature came about as a result of seeing God in control, and he was the lawgiver. And so now we have laws of nature as a result of believing God. And yet scientism does away with that kind of thing, right? And so that's his issue here. Mm-hmm. We have a background beliefs, what he calls plausibility structures, assumptions that are based on scientism, and they erase morality and spirituality from out of the discussion. He says, secondly, scientism has brought about several shifts that now define our culture. Embracing scientism, he tells us, is like knocking over the first domino, leading to a cascade of other beliefs that will fall by the wayside. And so this is true when it comes to how our culture defines things like knowledge, truth, duty, virtue, freedom, and tolerance. These things begin to be either knocked over or redefined, as we'll see here, as a result of our embracing of scientism.
Right. Right. We want to, kind of poo-poo the slave-holding rich white men that founded the country, but then hold up the documents that their background, culture, religion informed to write those documents, and then be able to stand on the thing that they created in order to spit on them. So we're communistic in that we've taken over the sugar plantations, and then once we run out of other people's money, we start pointing the finger of blame for why the system isn't working. And so we're about there in our cultural impact, and so we'll see if we can pull out of the death spiral then.
Yeah, so instead of, standing on the shoulders of giants, we, kick the shoulders of giants, right? We wipe our feet on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah. And when they start to fall because we've been kicking them too much, we suddenly are crying out because we're falling. Who would have thought that would be the case? Well, this first shift in the realm of religion and ethics and is a shift from knowledge to blind faith. Shortly after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, Oprah Winfrey focused an entire episode of her program on the turn to God since the attack, a turn she herself wished to foster. And I do remember this, and I think you can find this online as well. I think there was some audience participation, even from some Christians in the audience as well, or it could have been kind of in the episodes leading past this episode. But this is how Oprah responded to 9/11. She urged people to seek God. She said, whatever he, she, it, or they mean to you, and again, this is 2001, we should not get hung up on the word we use for him, her, it, or them, she cautioned. The important thing is that we all seek our own truth with renewed vigor. And again, this is the kind of almost height of the postmodern movement, where what's true for me is not always true for you. But this idea that she's wanting to posit here is, a think of something higher. And with that, again, she's borrowing on capital of Christianity by turning to this general view. And we'll go in and talk about a little bit of what her idea is here.
Yeah, and Moreland ask us, what assumptions, most likely subconscious, must Oprah Winfrey and her editorial crew be making about religion and the audience's understanding of it, right? God, whatever he suggests that the assumption is that in contrast to scientific assertions, religious claims are neither factual in nature nor subject to rational evaluation. Religion is not a domain of fact and knowledge, and so it can be whatever we think it is, right? Whatever we think God is, whatever we think our truth about God is, then we can seek that. And so it's nothing like, science, which is hard and factual and that sort of thing. In the book, he kind of expands on this illustration, and he asks, what would she say if it was an outbreak of polio, right? Would she say, well, turn to whatever you believe will cure polio, whether it's candy or whatever, just take whatever you need to do, but we need to turn to our own solution, which she wouldn't say that, right? But when it comes to religion or God, this is kind of everything's up in the air, and it's whatever you think or whatever you believe. That's your truth.
Right. And he would say that she would bring on doctors, right, to talk about this, to bring in the experts. But here she has her own ideas of what is acceptable to have as the basis of your belief system.
Right. The idea that anybody can be an expert, right? Because this is not a truth claim per se.
Right. So the hidden assumptions, even of that, once we get past, if you're a Christian watching that's going to make your hackles stand on end. But there's a greater assumption there that we should focus on, according to Moreland. All right, well, the second shift then into the realm of guidance for living one's life, and it goes from truth to the immediate satisfaction of desire, right? From truth to satisfaction. kind of a different path to take. You might think, oh, I've gotten the right answer, and you feel good about it, but this is a shift in a different way. Scientism tells us that there's no truth related to the meaning and purpose of life. Right. This is, the nihilistic of it all. Go to work, keep going to work, and one day you'll wind up dead, and then you won't have to go to work. There's a difference, the difference between right and wrong, or virtue and vice, life and death, and of course God himself. All those, there's kind of no truth, because again, what does scientism deal with? It deals with the hard sciences. It deals with the natural world, and you can't titrate it. You can't do a scratch test. You can't break, virtue down to its basic elements and reconstitute it in a different way. So if it can't touch it, therefore there's no truth related to it. So this is the fish being asked to climb a tree. It's just going to continue to swim in its bowl. And even if there were truths in the area, no one could have a clue as to what they are. It follows that truth as the first priority guide for living must be dethroned. If you're talking about it and it's not science, get out of the way, because we're here with the answers. We can show you, we can point to you, we can walk you through the experiments, and therefore we have a greater truth claim, because we can do the things that science does, and science is the area of philosophy, well, not philosophy, because that'd be wrong. The area of science that we can point to point back to all these things we're able to do. Well, that's just because it's able to do those things because of what it is. And so it's trying to bite off more than it can chew there. Well, after all, who can guide his life by an unknowable set of truths that probably aren't really there anyways? But people need something to guide their lives, and so the absolution of instant gratification and the satisfaction of personal desires have replaced truth. So again, this is if you get a good feeling, do whatever you want, as long as it doesn't hurt other people. Again, There's a sneak in there of kind of utilitarianism, but this do what thou will, which harkens back to Satan in Paradise Lost. So we might want to think about exactly what we're quoting there when we use those things.
Right. And then the third shift he suggests here is in ethics. And he says it goes from positive duty, right, and virtue to do no harm minimalism. So what is that all about?
Right.
Well, he says, given scientism, moral knowledge is impossible because it's not a physical, material thing that science studies. And so there is no knowledge attached to it because science can't study that. It's not a physical thing. And so moral knowledge is impossible. And so the loss of moral knowledge, then, he tells us, has meant a shift from a view in which duty and virtue are central to the moral life to what he calls a minimalist ethical perspective. He tells us to remember that moral rules without knowledge degenerate into customs, such as don't eat your peas with a knife. And he says customs then are too trivial to marshal the courage and effort needed to live by and internalize them. And so a minimalist ethics, he says, can be expressed in a single proposition, something like this. One may morally act in any way one chooses, so long as one does not do harm to others. So that's it. That's your minimalist ethics. Do whatever you want. Act any way you want, as long as you don't harm others. Boom, now you're being ethical.
Yeah. So this positive duty, these are your oughts. And what ought you do for your fellow man? And so we have laws, at least here in America, of ironically entitled the Good Samaritan Law. And so the Good Samaritan Law kind of gives you legal protection if you cause harm while you're pulling someone out of a burning car and you break their arm. Well, you're not held responsible for that broken arm legally or civilly, because you're doing what's best to preserve life, and so you have legal protection there. But what some people also don't realize that Good Samaritan Law does is it provides you coverage for not helping. So you come across a drowning child and you don't want to get your hair wet that day. Well, you have no obligation to jump in and save that person. So you are legally protected. You have no positive duty to jump in and save the drowning child. And so you can be free to do no harm. You're not harming the child by jumping in and letting them drown. They're already drowning. So you have no duty to jump in. Now, do we want to live in a society like that? Let's turn to another example and look at the court system. You have a duty there. You're charged with a duty to view everybody as being innocent until proven guilty. Well, if you have no positive duty in the world, if it's all just do no harm, minimalism, you can say, well, yeah, sure, I'll do it, but that person looks shady, and I think they've already done it, so I don't even have to listen to it. I know that he's killed the woman across the hall because he looks shady, and so that's how I'm going to make my personal decision. But before we built into cultures this the Greeks term it the paideia of utilizing education to form the person for the purpose of making a good society. So this divorce between individualism and community has really come about. Especially, it's easy to blame American independence, but I think from the too broad coalition of applying that broad sense, I think we've gotten away from what type of independence we're talking about there. So when we talk about these duties, that seems like such a foreign tongue these days of I have obligations to fellow people. I should treat others as the way that I wanted to be treated. So if I'm drowning, I would want somebody to come in. And yeah, if you have to break my arm to save me from drowning, please do. So the legal protection is fine there, but there is still a duty, hopefully, to come across a drowning child or me, so especially me, and save me. So please do. Everyone has my permission to save me from drowning. So thank you. All right, the fourth shift is related to the third, but is manifested in the area of freedom, moving from a classical model to a contemporary version. Classically, freedom meant the power to do what one ought to do. There's our ought again. So again, our ears should perk up at the word when we read a philosophy book. Classic freedom is liberating, but a necessary condition of such freedom is the availability of the relevant sort of knowledge. And again, I always think in the term picture of the train riding on the rail. You have the rules, you have the laws there put in place so that you can be the good train. You can go down the path of the rail, and you don't want the broken rail, you don't want the big sand pits in the way. You just want to be able to travel from point A to point B, what one ought to do to be a good train. And we think freedom is the ability to look at the river next to the bridge on the railroad track and go, ooh, I want to go swimming, right? So that's not freedom, that's going off the track of being what the good train does, stay on the track. Absent such knowledge, contemporary freedom has come to be understood as the right to do whatever one wants to do. But funding the shift from classical to contemporary freedom, scientism inevitably leads to moral bankruptcy. Why? Because it has nothing to say about morality. And so you just then get personal desires, personal feelings. Great big brain science man tells you that he knows all the secrets of the universe. And then you say, okay, well, what should I do when it comes to treating others? And then all you get is his personal opinion because he's big brain smart man. So it's again kind of providing the shade or the cover to a different mountain to look somebody up on. A big brain science person earned it, has all the accolades, has all the letters after his name. You have to call him doctor before, during, and end of the conversation, and he's capitalizing on the capital of being on that type of mountain. But when you ask then a question that doesn't relate to their field, well, and especially in these days when everything is very micro-focused on what their knowledge base is, they're treading on that type of be able to tell you how they want you to live. But you can just go, well, I don't really believe that. And we all just have to shrug our shoulders and hopefully not nuke each other off the planet.
Yeah. So finally, he tells us that scientism, he's going to talk about the whole notion of tolerance here now. And he says scientism warrants a shift in how we think about and practice tolerance. Again, moving from a classical model to a contemporary one. So according to the classical sense of the principle of tolerance, notice, a person holds that his own moral views are true and are known by him to be such, and those of his opponents are false. But he still respects his opponent as a person, and he respects his right to make a case for his own views. So under the classical view of tolerance, the whole notion of tolerance is they are wrong, but they have a right to be wrong, right? I don't accept their false belief, right? I believe my belief is true, theirs is wrong, but they have a right to it, right? Strictly speaking, he tells us on the classical view, one really is tolerating persons and not their ideas, right? They're wrong about their ideas. Their ideas are wrong, and so they're wrong, but I tolerate them. They have a right to be wrong, and that sort of thing. So that's the kind of the classical view of tolerism. It's based on disagreement, really. is the idea here, right? We disagree, but tolerance says you have a right to your particular opinion. And so, although I don't accept it because it's wrong, you have a right to make your case for your view.
Yeah.
That's the classical view of tolerance.
Boy, I wonder what system views people in a similar, one could say almost image that they also bear within themselves to view them in the similar fashion. Maybe as some kind of, let me just throw out a Latin term of imago Dei here and say there might be a system in place that has provided for the best level of tolerance, and we can treat each other as maybe one would want to be treated as well.
How about that? Yeah.
That's antiquated. Let's throw it out. Sorry, I came from primates. You came from a fish. We know primates are better because I say so.
Never the two shall meet.
That's right. Well, classical tolerance presupposed the reality of moral knowledge. For that reason, it cannot survive in the culture of scientism. Again, it doesn't touch it, so it can't survive. It needs to waste away out in the wilderness. And it is scientism that has led to the contemporary view of tolerance. The contemporary version of tolerance, popular in the general culture, goes beyond the cultural version in claiming that one should not even judge that other person's point of view as wrong. Thus, the very act of disagreeing morally with someone is intolerant. And again, you can be tolerant in all things except for one's intolerance. And if you're intolerant of other people's intolerance, that's true tolerance.
Right. Yeah. So we have this distinction then between the contemporary version and what he calls the classical version. Classical version is based on the idea that I believe my beliefs are true and yours are wrong, but I should tolerate, I should allow you have a right to hold to those beliefs. The contemporary version says, that we should not judge your viewpoint as wrong. We should tolerate your viewpoint, which is different than the classical view, right? So that's the idea. Now, he's going to kind of talk to us about why this particular, I need to tolerate your viewpoint, it doesn't work, right? Why it's deeply flawed. And he gives us a couple of ways to see this. He says, first, this idea of I need to tolerate your viewpoint, even though, it may be wrong, I still have to tolerate it. He says it cannot be consistently asserted or lived out because those who affirm it imply that others who do not share their view of tolerance are wrong. So notice it's attempting to say that you're not wrong. I'm being tolerant by saying you're not wrong, but it's what you said earlier. But if somebody is not tolerant, then they are wrong.
Right.
Well, wait a minute. You're not being tolerant about intolerance. You're being tolerant about everything else, but not intolerance. That's not fair. It's being inconsistent, right? In other words, people who follow this new version, he tells us, of tolerance, do not tolerate those whom they consider intolerant, right? So again, it's kind of an inconsistent view. I'll tolerate everything but your intolerance.
Yeah.
Well, that's, why are you accepting, making an exception out of my intolerance? So that's the first problem he sees. It's not being consistent. Mm-hmm. Secondly, he says it silences the moral protest of evil, such as a child molestation or racism and so forth, right? In other words, moral protests of evil can't be accepted, or at least can't be claimed. You can't talk about them because now you're being intolerant if you do. Right? Before one can morally protest something, he tells us, he or she must judge it to be wrong and not worthy of being tolerated. But if the new tolerance says nothing is wrong and I have to accept it, well, now you can't protest moral evil, right? And so he says, such is the culture in which we live now. We have scientism largely to thank for it. Thank you very much, scientism.
Right. And so, yeah, the racism or returning a call to end women's suffrage, those at least currently are still in the zeitgeist of being viewed as negative. But that molestation area seems to keep peeking its head out a little bit more. And again, we have to ask then, at what point do we allow that into the conversation as a legitimate item? And, we don't want to be viewed as intolerant of these poor people out here wanting to do stuff. And, who is it of us? Which of us has been without sin to cast the first stone? And, it's not even a sin to them. So Why shouldn't we allow this to happen? And so we have to then come up with all these kind of savings right now, but the conversations are happening right now for that. And so we'll see where this goes post middle of 2025.
Yeah, notice if scientism says that ethical claims are meaningless, right? Because they're not scientific claims. They're not part of the physical universe, so we can't examine them scientifically. So if ethical claims are meaningless, then who are you to say that this particular ethical behavior is wrong?
Yeah, right.
You can't say that. You have to accept it. You have to be tolerant of it, right? And that's the point he's trying to make here.
Right. And then you just ask, ought I be tolerant? And that's where the whole thing crumbles, and we have our saving issues there. All right, well, we almost made it through chapter 1. We couldn't quite do it because we had things to say as well as along with the author. And who would have thought that at such a junction in life as this, we might have things to say. So we'll kind of close out here. Next time we'll finish chapter 1 and probably do all of chapter 2. So if you're reading along with us, you might be...
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2 into chapter 3. My apologies. Yes. And so next time you might just have a chapter ahead of us to catch up. So again, all the links to the book are below. Amazon and Logos has it, and even an Audible presentation if you want to listen to it on your ride to work, where you will continue to do so until such time as you shake off the mortal coil and experiencing nothing which you experienced in the time beforehand, and it all didn't matter. So at least you read a book in between, right? That's all that matters. Well, again, you can go to caveofthecross.com for all our past books and check out all the clips on YouTube and even all the shorts on there as well. That has been fun watching people interact with shorter versions of things like answering the greatest questions that life has, which is kind of an ironic statement, but maybe one day we'll shake off the shorts and ought not to do those anymore. But all right, we'll see you next time, and thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.